Welcome to Design Talks Now, hosted by Design Pavilion, which was created to help inform the public on the thinking that goes behind architecture, design of all disciplines, and urban planning. I'm Eileen Shaw, producer of the Design Pavilion and Design Talks. Today we present innovation, beauty, and new adjustable ways of living. We're learning firsthand right now that every crisis evokes an opportunity for a paradigm shift. And in that shift, sharing knowledge and creativity is hugely beneficial for an architectural practice and people who need their solutions most. We'll be probing a fascinating case study which led to an invention and a solution created in 2008 for a school in crisis in Liberia. And the application was successfully translated to a recently completed sustainable solar townhouse right here in New York City. Our panelists hold that social responsibility is part of being a citizen of the world. We welcome to the conversation Winka Dubeldam, architect and founder of Architectonics, and Dr. William Braham, author and professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and Michael Provenza, Commercial VP for Trespa North America. And you'll learn more about them in just a moment from our moderator, Matthew Morani, Program Manager and Editor for the Architects newspaper. And now, let's begin.
Hello, I'm Matthew Morani, Program Manager and Editor for the Architects newspaper, and welcome to this week's Design Talks Now, Innovation, Beauty, and New Adjustable Ways of Living. Winka Dubeldam is the Miller Professor and Chair of Architecture in the Stuart Weitzman School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania, and has also taught at Columbia and Harvard, among other schools. Dubeldam was the external examiner for the AA in London for 6 years and was named one of the Design Intelligence 30 Most Admired Educators in 2015. Winka is also the founder and principal of the WBE firm Architectonics, and widely known for her award-winning work. Architectonics recently won an international competition to design the 2022 Grand Central Asian Games Park in Hangzhou, China, a multifunctional 47-hectare sports park. Her publications include the 3 monographs Winka Dubeldam Architect, AT Index, and Architectonics. A new book, Strange Objects, New Solids, and Massive Forms, is planned for release in fall 2020. William W. Braham, PhD, is a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he previously served as chair and is currently director of the Master of Environmental Building Design and of the Center for Environmental Building and Design. He has worked on energy and architecture for over 30 years as a designer, consultant, researcher, and author of numerous articles and books. He recently published Architecture and Systems Ecology, Thermodynamic Principles for Environmental Building Design in 3 parts. He also co-edited Energy Accounts, Architectural Representations of Energy, Climate, and the Future, Architecture and Energy, Performance and Style, and Rethinking Technology, a reader in architectural theory. He is currently working on a project called The City Always Writes in the Plural, Narratives of Urban Self-Organization. Michael Provenza is Commercial Vice President of Trespa North America, a division of the Netherlands-based architectural manufacturer of high-quality cladding. Now I'll be moving on to our questions for today, and I think we'll start with Winka for this one. Can you provide a bit of background on both of these projects? How did the orphanage project in Liberia come about? And how were material lessons and design approaches learned there applied to the 512 GW townhouse in New York?
Thank you, Matt. It's a good question. Yeah, it was interesting when we were talking about this session. It came to mind that obviously there are more moments in life when you go through a really tough time. And we were talking about what's going on and how architecture relates to these moments. And what came to mind is in 2008, but when the market collapsed, obviously we architects had no work or postponed work. And at some point I was talking to the office and I felt like if we didn't have clients, we maybe should think of a moment to give something back and to think of how to help maybe people are even worse off than any of us. So I remembered that I had met an amazing woman called Magdala who had a foundation, and that she was talking about a school. So I called Magdala and said, what about that school? I have decided, since we have some time now, that we would like to help you pro bono. And she was super excited, but it turned out it wasn't exactly just a school. It was more like a whole orphanage and a school. But, we decided, we had said yes, we were going to be yes. And we started on this project. Yeah, it was a super interesting thought. How do you build something in a country with a climate like Africa? Talking about built environment, the site was a huge amount of nature, right? I mean, you could choose either between this plot of nature or that plot of nature. No neighbors. And I went with her to Africa to find a site for the orphanage. And having seen Africa and understood the social systems and the way they are building there, which is a whole other class in understanding culture, we decided that the orphanage should not be a large building, but more like a village, a sustainable village. And these are high school kids. Actually, they're children from 4 to like 17. So you go from kindergarten to normal low-grade schools into high school, and then they go hopefully study somewhere. But that they needed different areas to have dinner and lunch. They needed areas to sleep. They needed areas to do homework. So it became this kind of study of climate versus environment versus comfort, really, and living environment. And so the other thing was, because we did it pro bono, I was, it was super exciting to work with the kids, to meet Magdala. And I started talking to people about it, because I was so excited. One of the people I talked to was Trespa, the person in Holland from Trespa. And he was like, I would love to offer, to sponsor a material for the trellis you're thinking of, because I had made buildings with perforated concrete block that I trained the local people in making. And then we had a secondary skin that was kind of more like a shading device, but an extra large one. So it created extra spaces for kids to do homework or to meet or to hang out. And so they offered to do that. And then the roofs were catching rainwater. There was double roofs for natural ventilation. So that was a whole study in social systems, climate, and making. Fast forward to maybe 4 years ago, when I got a project from clients where they asked to extend a townhouse west of Soho in Manhattan, in New York. And long story short, it was also in a flood zone. So a similar, not the same, but a similar problematic area. And of course, New York's climate is actually quite harsh. It's very cold in the winter, very hot in the summer. And we started looking at all the setback requirements for the building. And it became at some point where the existing building and the extension were the same size. And architecturally, I felt this was unacceptable. So we introduced a third building. And the third building became, again, this extra large skin that creates a roof room rather than a roof terrace. It creates in the front of the building terraces that are enclosed. And it allows for the winter to have the shutters open and to have passive solar energy, heat. And in the summer to close the trellis and have a reduction of need for air conditioning. So that it became a much more comfortable climate, but also for my clients to have privacy, to hang out. It's very unusual in New York City to be able to hang out over the sidewalk in your on your little terrace. So it's a nice building, and it's a very different living and work environment. Well, because this was the other thing. One partner more or less works there as well. They have several kids. It's a busy family with kids and nannies and work and live. So it's a small micro environment in itself.
I was wondering, just with this building model, how you believe that it could potentially inform and or guide changing social and living environments going forward.
Well, what I realized recently, my clients were interviewed, and this is, it's kind of funny because this is the first time I heard about it, but they were interviewed. We were this for a wallpaper article, and the journalist was asking my clients, did they use the building different before the COVID pandemic and after? And they were explaining that they actually completely changed their behavior in the house, and that they thought that they used to live in a loft and now they live in this 8-story stacked townhouse for one family. That actually the different levels were super helpful because you could have these activities happening all over the place and completely not disturb each other. So someone could have a serious work meeting on one level, the kids could be playing with the nanny on another level, and they could have guests entertaining the guests on another level. The journalist asked, are you actually opening and closing the trellis? Because, it's a question, right? You never know. And the client said, he never thought he would say this, but he opens and closes it all the time because he loves editing the view, or then having more view himself, or having more privacy himself, or seeing the city or not seeing the city. And it was very funny that I had never heard them say that. So it was interesting for me also to see that the facade got some agency and some became an active participant in their social environment, which was really sweet to hear, because that's what you envision, when you're thinking of it. That living in New York, I used to have a roof terrace myself where I never went because so many people looked out on it. And when I was designing their house, I thought it'd be nicer if there was a trellis kind of room on the roof. So it has a level of privacy, and also shading, because it gets very, very hot in Manhattan, as you know. But yeah, it was good to hear that actually that's also the case for them.
And I guess following on that theme of, I don't want to say it's a new trend, but in many ways it's sort of a return to operable facades overall. Bill, I was wondering if maybe you could expand a little bit on potential benefits of double skin facades overall, because I believe you have quite a bit of research in that area.
Yeah, sure, Matt. Well, first of all, I should say Winka and I have been colleagues for 25 years, and I was super excited to see particularly the project in Liberia, also 512, because these are so close to the things we do research on. And it's the way of busy colleagues, you talk about what's at hand rather than, what you're working on. I think it's fair to say layered and shaded structures have been part of architecture from the beginning of time. Certainly in climate adaptive architectures of all kind, they form like a fundamental strategy. Think, for example, about shaded porches and covered courtyards and arbors, sleeping porches, things that are characteristic of every climate and every architecture. And yet most of those have been lost with the advent of AC and the advent of other systems. There's a joke in my world, which is until you have air conditioning, the coolest room in the house is the screen porch. And after you get air conditioning, the hottest room in the house is the screen porch, which is why people end up not being outside. Sometime mid-century, progressive architects recognized exactly the kinds of things that Winka was just describing. The opportunity to give people different spaces that they can occupy at different times of year, not just about energy, but about different kinds of comfort. So anyway, I was super excited to see those two projects. From what we've seen, the project in Liberia is really characteristic of the best strategies you can imagine for those hot, humid climates. We just did a quick, analysis based on some of the models she sent us. If you just had the typical buildings sitting out there in the sun, it's close to the equator, it would be in the high 90s Fahrenheit. With that shaded structure, it gets down to being mostly comfortable most of the time. It's a really, really super effective strategy in that climate. And also by opening it up and letting what breezes they can capture go through, that also helps people. Similarly, obviously New York is a completely different climate. As Winka said, these two extremes, you can't design for both. And in fact, buildings have to adapt. They have to be able to change their envelope if they're going to be good in one and good in the other. So that foldable screen is kind of perfect for that. But also, looking at it and, having lived enough time in New York, I was incredibly jealous of that, that roof terrace. And what we saw that extends the useful outdoor time you have by like 20 or 30%. There's parts that are shaded from the wind but are in the sun, other parts that are shaded from the sun, also from your neighbor's views and so forth. So again, on the one hand, this is what great architecture does, rediscovers the things that have made architecture work through the millennia. The thing we've learned over time both teaching students and doing projects, is when architects think about energy, things get very narrow. They get often very uninteresting. But when they start focusing on comfort, on the kinds of things we've just been talking about, it opens up many more architectural possibilities. So in this case, what we were specifically looking at was ranges of comfort, and there's a very nice metric that was developed over the last 20 years for analyzing this. So I guess to answer your question directly, we're running fairly simple computer simulations using incredibly sophisticated programs that are all now available to plug into architectural workflows. I will make a small pitch for Ladybug and Honeybee, which are Grasshopper plugins and written by a former student. They're free, so there's no, this isn't a commercial plug, but they are specifically conceived in order to bring those kinds of analyses into the architectural workflow to help architects do exactly what we're seeing Winca do in these projects.
So now moving on to Michael. Trespa is known for the production of highly durable and customizable facade panels. Trespa was applied for both projects as well. What makes this material so applicable as a rain screen and or shading element?
Well, thank you, Matt. First, I wanted to say to Winca, thank you for allowing Trespa to be part of the Liberian project and also the project in New York City. To answer your question, Matt, the design flexibility that Trespa offers in over 4,000 variations of decor range and thickness and so on and so forth allows the design professional to change the look of not just a building, but in some cases, entire neighborhoods with metallic decors and those type of interesting design elements. But specifically, the impact resistance and the highly UV resistant nature of the product makes it ideal for shading. The shading elements, both in Liberia and New York City, are, I guess, enhanced by the durability of the material that they're using. So 50-year life cycle analysis that we test to, extremely durable in impact resistance, but also UV. Both Bill and Wink could talk about the environments, New York City and Liberia. These are extremely harsh environments. We sell into 83 countries worldwide, and the product we make has to be tested to all those types of environments. So back to the question, why is it ideal for shading? Its longevity, its durability, and UV resistance really make it ideal for the design community to use.
So I was wondering if we could also just talk a bit more about the health benefits of double skin facades and how such building systems reduce the potential for contagion and going forward can bring us closer to sustainability goals. So maybe we can start with Winca there.
Yeah, sure. Right now we're in a pandemic that is an airborne disease, right? So it's one of the scariest things we have had to endure, I think, well, in my lifetime, but maybe even ever. And one that is not conducive to air conditioning, especially not like air conditioning that is lined on the inside with some fibrous material that is very absorbent of things. I've always been real scared of those, but now I'm really suspicious of them. So really important right now is natural ventilation in buildings, and as much as possible to turn off the air conditioning, or if a new building gets built, to insulate the ducts from the outside. And to keep so that you can wash the ducts regularly, which is very possible, right, with technology. So from my side, I would say what was great in building the townhouse is that they now have natural ventilation, shading. So that helps enormously reducing the use of air conditioning, or at some point even you can turn it off. And in new buildings, I'm definitely never lining a duct inside again.
Yeah, I mean, what Winca was doing at 512 is very much in the spirit of buildings which have used double envelopes to try and dramatically increase natural ventilation. When she talked about her, the occupant, the resident who commissioned that, you going out there, so that's real work. Somebody has to go out and decide when to close it and when to open it and when to open the windows, which are, traditionally were things that people learned by growing up in a certain kind of building. But there is a whole class of typically larger, more engineered buildings using double skins to do almost exactly that. Essentially, what it exists to do is to allow them to have 100% fresh air moving through the building at all time, no air being returned, which is common in most air conditioning systems. We've all seen lots of studies of aerosols. not just diffusing them, but moving them out of the building is one of the best strategies. The historian in me can't resist also pointing out that much of what we consider characteristic elements of the modern movement of the 1920s and 30s were specific responses to the tuberculosis epidemic. The clean surfaces, removal, the carpets that can be taken out, screen porches and sleeping porches were actually a quite specific public health activity. Introducing more sunlight, having more fresh air. All of those were things that came as much from the public health side as from the architectural side. And I give the architects of that era credit for, recognizing the potential and using it to start a new architecture. That's a great example, and also what we're seeing in 512 and some of the more progressive buildings today. The thing that I think people really appreciate, which is when architecture is, and I won't make a distinction between technical achievements and aesthetic ones, but when architecture actually helps people see new ways of living or new ways of being together in buildings, and nothing like a crisis to make us pay closer attention.
What is really interesting is we're working on a renovation for a very, very large hospital in Staten Island called Seaview. It's a very Baroque layout, and we're adding housing to that and a lot of therapeutic things, so that basically the whole thing becomes a healthy living community. And so this is specifically also for people who have partners who are, for example, have ALS or any other long-term disease, that they can live with them.
Just in the current situation, we have a couple innovative customers using our material. We spoke about screening for New York City, which is a facade screening, but also on the interior. So you have a lot of doctor offices, medical offices where people are waiting, and a lot of times they're sick patients waiting to see the doctor. So material like Trespa is being used now in a different way, not just in facades and other materials, but actually for cordoning off patients or to separate more of the social distancing when sitting in public buildings.
One subject I think we could explore a little bit further is this, this transformation of spatial experiences that could potentially be underway. I guess one thing I'm curious about is if you see current building stock being adapted to address current issues, and if this is sort of a long-term trend, or how feasible is potentially adding further ventilated elements to facade and building systems going forward.
Yeah, so I could say two things. One, it does turn out it is actually pretty hard to completely retrofit buildings built specifically for air conditioning, right? Ceiling heights tend to be lower, everything is optimized. So you have to be pretty innovative. That said, there have been projects, I think I remember a Herzog and Demeron project, which actually added a double envelope outside of an existing building specifically to be able to do that. Now, you have to have the dimension to do it. On the other hand, and New York is characteristic of this, there are lots of pre-mid-20th century buildings that were designed for that originally, or at least partially for that, and they're much more amenable to this kind of renovation. One of the things I saw in a project in Seattle a couple of years ago was a innovative developer going in and discovering that buried behind the sheetrock were the old transoms on top of the windows, which allowed cross ventilation from one office over the transom through the hallway and so on. So things that have gotten completely factored out of current architectural discourse with a little bit more ceiling height make it possible to have exactly that kind of airflow.
Yeah, and what's also really interesting, Matt, is that there's a huge amount of rethinking going on. So as opposed to 2008, when we had either no work canceled or frozen or whatever, this time it's actually really busy because people are really rethinking how they want to live, how they want to work, do they want to combine it? And although everyone seems to think that people are moving out of the city, I have as many people moving into the city as people moving out of the city. So I don't think it's just a trend one way. It's just everyone's rethinking their priorities and thinking, what is it that we really think we want to do, and how do we want to live, and what is this work-live relationship? How important is it to have these social relationships when we're all having been inside for so many months, which is super interesting. But one thing I was also thinking when Bill was talking is that we actually didn't just start thinking about new office spaces now. We started thinking about this, and probably Bill was also working on that a while ago. Maybe 15 years ago, there was a huge influx of problems with office spaces called sick building syndrome. And the problem was static carpets, fluorescent lights, and air conditioning together create a massive problem for health and for the way people feel in that space. It's also the static of the computer, right? So it's like all those four components together are the worst case scenario of what you could ever do to a person. So I actually worked on quite a few projects over the years where we started changing natural fibers for carpets or putting wood floors or concrete floors, no fluorescence, natural ventilation, teach people to take a walk, for lunch outside to kind of build your positive and negative ion balance back. It's a really interesting thing. So this is not the first time we're revisiting it. And I think it's probably good that we revisited it like 10 years ago, because actually right now some of the offices are not as bad as they used to be 15 years ago.
And if I were going to put if I'm talking to students, I always say, design the building first for daylighting, because of course, in order to get daylight deep into buildings, you do the things that we saw done in buildings for generations. But it means then that all these other things are much easier. Airflow is much easier. And yes, sick building syndrome was just a real wake-up call for, particularly for the US HVAC industry.
Yeah, like productivity of people went way down and sick days were enormous. So when they started solving that, they actually got productivity way up. It was unbelievable how much that impacted.
I guess you can very much tie that to a fair amount of hospital design at this point. Because anything, let's say around the turn of the century compared to what was built 1960s onward is actually quite depressing in terms of daylighting and natural ventilation. So it's interesting to see how that there's, I guess, a return to that emphasis on natural systems.
And there are studies, when students discover these, it just makes their heads explode. Doctors doing studies of the recovery rates of patients, all who've had exactly the same procedure. In one set were in rooms that faced a brick wall, and others were in a room that had a view out to a park. The ones with the view to the park took less pain medicine, and they also recovered. It was enormous. It was like 20 to 30% faster than those who were in a room facing a brick wall. So one can overstate this, but on the other hand, it's pretty clear that people are happier when they have light, have air, and have some connection to the world outside.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess just returning to the design of hospitals in the 19th century and early 20th century, there was very much an emphasis on glazed tiles as a sanitary measure. Do you see Trespa fulfilling a similar role within hospital design? Because you mentioned earlier that in waiting spaces, it's now being introduced as a material. Do you see it as something that's easy to wipe down, clean, and basically make the maintenance staff's job a lot easier and also improve safety for staff members and patients?
Oh, absolutely, Matt. We have a division I'm not involved with directly, but I could speak to it a bit. We have a facade division, which is my area of expertise in North America, but we also have a global laboratory furniture division. So this material is similar in the way that it's an HPL, high-pressured laminate material, very durable, as with the facade. But the added feature to the laboratory material is it's highly antimicrobial, and it's designed specifically for laboratory work. So yeah, absolutely. There's been quite a bit of influx, as you can imagine, during this pandemic for this type of material. There's an extension of an existing hospital, and they used the Trespa facade material on the outside for design as a rain screen, and then our laboratory material for the interior, which made quite a bit of difference. Because of the closed cell structure of the material, bacteria and microbial infection doesn't have a chance to sit on it. So it's an ideal type of material for, again, unfortunate situations we find ourselves in now. So yeah, absolutely. It's been a big realization of our top lab scientific furniture type material as well.
And Bill and Winka, during the pause of this crisis, are there any aspects of sustainable and or high performance design that you are hoping to translate to your current and or future projects?
Yeah, very much so. I think people are now, I mean, if they were not already fully aware of the benefits of creating a healthy living environment. And the other thing I think is really important in cities is to have buildings that have a very low level of maintenance, just because of the simple fact is you cannot get to these surfaces very easily. So when we did this very big 3D trellis envelope, which wraps on 3 sides of the building, we were very aware of the fact that they probably would never get back to, most of it. And that we needed a material that wouldn't warp, that would require no maintenance, wouldn't fade, but basically virtually maintenance-free, warp-free material, because in close, very dense urban city situations, you need to know that you have a material that you could use. What is really interesting is Europeans build buildings very differently. People, for example, I built 497 Greenwich with a folded glass facade, and people talk about it like a folded glass building. It's not. It actually has 3 sides of concrete, heavy concrete cavity walls with insulation and natural ventilation in the cavity, and balconies and openable windows, and everything is passive solar energy, and it has radiant floor heating. It's a complete European building. And what was very funny is when I moved from my loft in Soho, I moved myself in my own building, which always people think is the most insane thing an architect can do. But yeah, I moved in. And the first thing when I moved in is that I had this moment where I thought, where is everyone? Because it was completely quiet. And I realized that buildings in New York are not insulated at all, or not anywhere near that they should be. So you constantly have an audible overload, or a visual overload, or a smell overload. So your sensory system is always exhausted. And when I was in that building, I actually literally opened the window and thought, that's where they are, and closed it again. Because I had, done a complete, in my innocence, because I didn't know anything about the US. I only knew what I knew from Holland. I had built a completely European building that was heavy, solid, and had 1 west facade that was passive solar energy, but also built a lot of balconies and very thick insulated glass. So that would be my message to developers here, is like really understand that if you build that way, you do actually create an environment where you do not have to move out of the city. You are living in a complete quiet environment that does not overload your senses. All New Yorkers are like nervous wrecks because we are always overloaded. Our senses are constantly hearing or seeing or smelling something.
I think from my side, the two things that the pandemic has brought on very quickly. One, those of us who are paying attention to climate change have been trying to figure out how to get people to fly less. And literally 5 months ago, we were passing a resolution for the faculty at Penn, and trying to think of ways to encourage people to fly less. And, would it be possible that you could give a talk remotely? Was it possible that a conference could be? It all seemed a little far-fetched. And then literally turn of a dime, suddenly it becomes super possible. And so that's an interesting thing, but the effect on transportation does have a huge effect. It'll take a long time to play out on the way cities are organized. But the bigger one, I think, is the ease with which people have discovered they can work at home, or a certain kind of work. So what is that? 40% of the population has discovered that they actually are able, at least much of the time, to work at home. We had a conversation a bunch of years ago with the General Services Administration, and they said they do studies constantly to see how well their spaces are being used. And they said they were discovering that somewhere between 40 and 60% of the spaces, particularly offices, were not occupied. That most people's jobs is not to sit in the chair and talk on the phone and do on the computer. It was to have, you have your office, but then you're off doing something else. So they were, recognizing that lots of smart architects and lots of smart businesses have been trying to figure out how to be more efficient about that. Yes, to have an office, but recognize that people aren't going to be there all the time. that they can work at home, they can work other places. And we've just accelerated that process dramatically. I don't know that it means people moving in or out of the city quite as obviously, but it will certainly change the internal organization of cities. Where are people when they go to lunch? The concentrations we've had in cities like Manhattan, that shifts if people are not all coming into the office. So I look forward to seeing how that plays out, and whether, again, from the climate side, whether we see any reduction in the amounts of travel people are doing in order to do things.
Winka talks about European architecture or application of material. Being with Trespass for 7 years, I've learned quite a bit about rain screen. And unfortunately, from my experience working with architects, I think still in the United States, especially, we don't know enough about rain screen applications. And rain screen is simply put a way to mitigate moisture, but not fighting it, but working with it in a natural sense, much like the bark of a tree. Europe is doing this, and Winka well knows this is something very commonplace, to apply an exterior skin or a facade or a cladding, siding material. In the States, it's usually about fighting Mother Nature or caulking, sealing, doing these types of things. And with Trespa and rain screen type applications, it makes for a more long-lasting structure because you're blocking the environment, but you're also allowing the convection behind the facade to be a healthy environment. In terms of mitigating mold and those types of things, a normal, typical American facade, maybe a cement masonry type facade, you're blocking that, and inevitably Mother Nature is going to win. And you're going to have cracks, and that caulking and sealants that we all tend to use too much of in the United States is going to give way, and moisture is going to get in that building. And mold is not a friend to us. It's not a healthy element. So rain screen, I think it's becoming more well known, but it's certainly something I think we're going to understand more about during the pandemic, and I think just as rain screen applications become more and more popular here in the States.
You're totally right. It's a very good way to protect also the waterproofing, because the waterproofing is very UV sensitive, and the rain screen is always protecting also the waterproofing from UV. We use the self-healing waterproofing that is basically, absorbing the little penetrations of the attachments. It's a much better way to get a building, especially lightweight buildings, like perfectly sealed and very very beautiful, actually. Beautiful detailing. You can miter everything. It's very pretty. I don't call myself green because I think it is our shared responsibility to take care of the climate and the situation we're all in. And also I feel like we need to build environments for people they can live in healthily. This cannot be a thing that is your speciality, because I think everyone should be doing it. All the buildings that I built are working that way. And I think it actually doesn't have to be, by the way, perfectly sealed. It needs to be very well insulated and ventilated. So it's the opposite of what they think here. And that's, I think, what Michael was getting to. Sealing a building is like faking it. What you need to do is you need to super insulate it, but at the same time ventilate it. Because ventilation actually takes care of removing moisture. Whereas if you close it and you don't ventilate it, moisture gets trapped and you get mold. And that's why, especially in the Midwest, they're removing houses, they're wrapping them in black plastic. You can never touch them again. They're full of black mold. Building physiology is actually, Bill knows everything about it, but it's a very serious profession. And sadly, not many builders or developers know anything about it here. You have to imagine a building is like an organism that needs to breathe and needs to move. So it's like a living organism. And if you shut it closed, it's like kill it, essentially. So it's really important to understand building physiology. And then every building should essentially try and be 70% passive energy, and then for the peak heating or peak freezing moments, you add, heating or cooling. But you can get very, very far by just using floor heating. that will catch 90%, for example, and will be very low energy. Like if your feet are cool or if your feet in winter are warm, your body is actually the most comfortable. What is the worst heat is hot air in your head. What's really important is your feet are warm and your head is cool. And this is like, and then this is kind of funny that so few people know this stuff. But that's why floor heating is so good, because you need very little heating to get a floor to heat and your feet warm. And the space itself can be relatively cool, and you can still be much more comfortable than when you overheat the space.
And just to jump in on Passive House, the formal Passive House Institute, and I always like this piece of history. This was originally developed in the US in the 80s with the early 80s super insulated houses. But then the Germans, as they are want to do, really engineered and perfected it. And so when it's done well, it is an amazing system of construction. It does sometimes become a little bit cult-like, meaning somebody learns about energy and building by studying Passive House, and then they think that's the only way that buildings can ever be conceived. But I think in your question is, there are really two different kinds of ventilation that we're talking about in buildings. One is the air that flows through that we're breathing, and that's mostly what we've been talking about in natural ventilation. But Michael's point about the ability of walls to breathe, or to lose the moisture that builds up, exactly what Wink is talking about in those details. Passive House, when it's done well, and a lot of it is done incredibly well, is about how do I super insulate it, seal so I don't get a lot of air leakage, but that the various layers can exchange moisture and breathe, which on the one hand is going back to older techniques, but adding a level of insulation that didn't exist before. There are also critics of Passive House because, oh my God, I'm in this, big, thick walled building with little tiny windows, and then I actually typically need an HVAC system to give me efficient ventilation. And there's the guru of building science is a guy, Joe Stieberuk, and he's talked for many years about exactly the wall that the rain screen type wall, different versions of what he calls the perfect wall. So, rain screen, space to ventilate, make sure you understand where the moisture is going. But then what I've always loved is he wrote a follow-on article called the other perfect wall, which is the one that is more similar to older walls, so that you're not just letting things flow through, but each of the layers is some degree permeable, so that over time moisture can move in and out, and you aren't trying to keep this absolute perfect boundary in between.
From the building material industry, we talk about passive home, but we also hear the term green a lot. And in my 30 plus years of experience working with Windows initially, Marvin Windows, there's a lot of greenwashing, as we call it. So, from Trespa's philosophy on sustainability is to build a durable product that's going to last for generations, as compared to recycling. Now, recycling is a good thing, I guess, in some respects, but our philosophy is that you build something that's going to last, 50 plus years, and then when it's outlived its usable application, maybe there's a change in color or something happens, we enter into a second life program. And this is something that we're just developing now in the Netherlands and Western Europe. So we put this out there just to, again, contribute to our philosophy on sustainability. So if you, for whatever reason, are remodeling a home and you have some Trespa material on it, or you decide after 20 years you want to change the color, we at Trespa will take that material back at no charge and recycle it into not another facade, but into garden furniture, HVAC screening, other, exciting type of exterior applications. So you're not chopping it up and using energy to recycle it somehow. You're actually using it. We did a nice project as Second Life. We had a renovation in a hospital in Calgary, up in Canada. We reused those materials in a playground. So children's playground, they're perfectly suited for exterior application, as we've been talking about. So that's our stand on sustainability, or not greenwashing, but making a real impact on the environment.
Thanks to Design Talks, this is a fabulous moment to finally find a place to chat all together. I think that is what is really important ultimately, to understand what it really means and how can you add value to social systems, climate change, ideas, sustainability, but still like make an architecture that is challenging and fun and new, and that challenges you as a person also, no? That to do new things or to hang out in new areas. You find those things only when you make them, right? And then when people start to use them in other ways, it's when you realize, oh my God, yeah, I hadn't thought about that either. But I think that's also, yeah, it's the beauty of New York. No?
So I guess from here, I'd like to thank Design Talks Now again for inviting all of us to speak today. It's been great to meet you all.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Matthew, Winka, Bill, and Michael, for sharing your expertise and stories. Your research and ingenious solutions led to an absolutely beautiful invention. And thank you all for joining us. This was our last of a long series of inspiring and heartfelt talks since May. If you missed any of these truly motivational and informative conversations, you can now find them on our website at designpavilion.com. That's design-pavilion.com. So while you're sitting on the beach or relaxing at the pool during your August holiday, just tune in and be charged with vigor and heartened with hope. Design Talks Now will resume a full, rich program in September with a focus on creativity and solutions, an uplifting series, and a peek at creatives working in parallel fields, including opera, animation, and even comedy. Just what we need as we enter a new season in our new world. So until September, stay in touch with our scheduling and continue to stay safe, stay smart, and remember, design stands together. See you soon.